Welcome to The Adaptive Mind, where we talk with experts about practical, effective approaches to breaking habits and changing behavior. I'm your host, Brady Dowling. I'm glad you're listening. After the episode, be sure to head over to theadaptivemind.com, where you'll find the full show notes and transcript from our discussion, as well as an episode cheat sheet. Each cheat sheet has the most important points, quotable moments, and specific actions you can take to implement the strategies we discuss. Head to theadaptivemind.com to access a cheat sheet for every episode. Thanks for joining this episode of The Adaptive Mind. On this episode, I have Jody Bechtold. She is the founder of Better Institute, where she runs psychotherapy and set of courses and a whole variety of different resources that we'll touch on throughout the episode. Today, we're going to be talking a lot about gambling and problematic gambling. So I'm really excited to get into this, and thanks for joining, Jody.
Great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. So to set the scene, I know gambling has been getting a lot of attention in the media, and especially because of different legal policies, at least in the United States, in the last 10 years or so. But let's say how bad is it? When are people starting? Can you just kind of give us a little education for those who are uninitiated?
Yeah, of course. It's a multi-prong answer, I would say. You kind of have to look at which states have many more forms of gambling. In the last 5 years, we've gone from 2 to upwards of 40 states that now have, as I say, expanded legalized gambling, whether it's more casinos, brick and mortar, whether it's sports betting, online, and then online could be sports betting, online could be casino, and those type of games of chance. So we're seeing the increase across the country for sure. Then we're seeing a younger demographic that has kind of always known fantasy sports. They've been in fantasy leagues. And if their state has legalized sports betting, it's kind of a rite of passage. And sometimes it's even a rite of passage before the legal age because the whole family's been involved in fantasy sports or talking about different teams. You watch TV today, so many gambling advertisements, so much gambling related advertisements, whether it's the logo and the brands throughout the hockey game or the basketball game, right? So you're talking about so many different people are kind of being inundated with gambling in a way we have never seen before the Supreme Court overturned the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. And for those that aren't familiar with that, when they overturned it, it allowed each state to decide what they wanted to do. And so obviously many states decided they wanted to do something because we're at 40 states and counting. So you're going to see a younger demographic just really see gambling very normalized, see it everywhere. You're going to see middle-aged and older demographics look at gambling kind of different now because it's just so accessible, and they used to think that gambling was at a casino or gambling was at a racetrack, but now it's everywhere. You can talk to people about the Powerball or whatever the big lottery one is right now that's over $1 billion, which is like record breaking. People can download an app connected to their bank account and buy a ticket within about 3 minutes. They don't leave their house, anything like that. So we're seeing gambling everywhere in a way we've never seen before. And it's so normalized at such a young age. Very different than talking about alcohol and drugs. Gambling is very different in terms of that. So lots of different ways to answer that question, depending on the age, depending on the state and their legislation, how ramped up they are, in terms of what is happening to people. So we're seeing, because so much of it is tech-based, we're seeing people get hooked, for a better word, lack of a better word, sooner, quicker. You don't have to get in your car, drive somewhere, have family wonder where your whereabouts, how long have you been gone? You have to hurry up and get home, come up with some reason why you were gone so long. You literally sit on your couch on your phone and it looks like you're texting or responding to emails. Right? Very different landscape.
Yeah. And you talked about how people young, like in a younger demographic, are starting earlier. Um, how young are people starting?
Well, I can talk about what we see, but we have to remember we don't really have a lot of research that is national. We have like maybe some state by state research. We might have very specific research that's saying the average age of a sports bettor is male, 26, well educated, lots of disposable income because they're well educated, and they're in a state with legalized, excuse me, a state with legalized sports betting. Um, we are also seeing lots going on in high schools. We are seeing, that is, you talk to teachers and they're saying absolutely everyone's talking about gambling. They're talking about betting. Sometimes they won't even use the word gambling anymore. It's placing a bet. And we're seeing a lot of individuals going into college already used to some sort of betting. Now they're doing it on campus, but they're doing it with a bookie. And when I say bookie, I don't mean that old stereotype. I mean someone else on campus that's older. Maybe it's the junior or senior on campus that is now acting as the bookie, and they have their own sports books. So many people don't realize how much this is everywhere.
Okay, so for also for the uninitiated, why don't people just stop when they lose a lot of money? And I don't did that to sound flippant, and like I know this is a serious problem. I don't want to other people with this issue. I think this is like a common question about really any kind of behavior, but like what is it that makes someone keep coming back when they've lost so much money?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you bring up a really good point. You can tell people who don't really fully understand the power of a disorder, also known as an addiction, when you don't ingest anything first. We're used to seeing behaviors and disorder behavior when someone's had too much alcohol or too much of a certain drug. And so for this particular disorder, you don't ingest anything first. So people say, well, just stop. Why don't you just stop? Right? Parents will say that. Loved ones will say that. Partners and spouses will say that until they really get more education and understand that gambling affects the dopaminergic system of the brain. It's happening in the prefrontal cortex with the impulsivity and decision making. But when it becomes habitual, it moves to a different part of the brain because it's a habit now. So it's so automatic that it's no longer a conscious decision about stopping or continuing. It's automatic. And I think that's at a very basic, so not to get into a lot of big words of brain, and neurobiology, it's moved in a different part of the brain.
And so what like behaviorally, process wise, what gets it from being like, I'm just gonna put a bet in here, put a bet in there, to becoming like really habitual into that mode?
Yeah. It depends on the person. They might have some predisposition to other addictive disorders. They might have attention deficit disorder or other impulsivity issues that will make them much more at risk for developing a problem with gambling. And it also has to do with what kind of access to money do they have, right? Obviously, if you don't have any more money, you can't keep gambling. So access to money and the gambling itself is psychologically designed to be, addictive, to have a hook to it.
Yeah, and maybe let's touch on that a bit more. So I think like thinking back on kind of the classic idea of gambling as going to a casino. Um, how would you juxtapose like the interaction and what gambling looks like now as opposed to maybe what you would see in Vegas, stuff like that?
Yeah, if you think about a casino, you have to drive, walk there, somehow get there. Then you have to have money to put into the machine. So how do you get the money? So usually you come with your money, maybe what you can afford to spend. You might also then go to the ATM at some point and get more money. That all that takes time, right? Then you might need to leave at some point because of family, like I've said before, and it becomes this thing that you do every once in a while. because it takes a lot of effort to get there. Where's your whereabouts? When it's now online, just online by itself, the act of technology can be much more designed to be kind of sticky and keep you coming back. And then your money, you don't put physical money into your phone or your computer. It's virtual. And so then money doesn't hurt as much when you spend it. So the more that you make it virtual, then you're separating yourself from the idea of real money. It's more easy to make bets. It's more easy to make larger bets because it's all somehow removing you from the act of real money and it just feels like numbers, right? Then you have these wins along the way. And when you have wins along the way, that's very behavior focused, kind of kind of the rewards and punishments. And so when you win along the way, it makes you want to keep doing it. Then the mind starts to say, wow, I won $500. Maybe I could double it. Right? And then you keep going. And where is the mechanism to stop? There's not a timer that shows up that says, you've just hit your 30-minute mark, time for you to go home, time for you to shut down. There isn't anything inherently in the design of gambling to say go home. You also, because you don't ingest anything first, it's not like you're going to pass out from too much gambling, whereas you're going to pass out from drinking too much. Right? So there's these things that just don't have any, um, signs that say, "Stop, you've hit your limit, time to go home." So usually running out of money is the first one. But if it's virtual, there's credit cards, there's cash advances. So then there's a way to get a payday loan. There's a way to get an unsecured loan online, through Quicken or something like that. The things we've seen in our country that allow us to get loans virtually very quickly without realizing what we're signing. We don't know how high the interest rates are, anything like that. We've seen some pretty devastating things, and they say, I didn't realize all of that was happening." So pretty addictive in just the psychology of it.
Yeah, that's I mean, it sounds almost like this systemic like risk that um we're kind of taking upon ourselves as a country, as like a greater population where, think about people talking about predatory loans, and this kind of just brings it into a different ballpark. So you talked about a few things like having this virtual money and kind of separating yourself from the idea of money. And that makes me think a lot of video games. I know there are a lot of digital platforms that kind of have this virtual currency, almost like Monopoly money, but really you're paying for it. Um, how do you think that gambling is similar to other addictive behaviors or like compulsive behaviors?
Yeah, I mean, gambling definitely shares what I would say several features and traits with other addictions. There's a tolerance, there's a withdrawal, there's a preoccupation, there's consequences. So there's quite a few that you could see even with, substance use. You can see it with gaming issues. You can see it with sexual behaviors. Um, but each of those disorders then has its own uniqueness. Right. And one of the things that stands out the most with gambling that's unique is that it's this concept of chasing. Right. And so chasing happens when you've lost a lot and you want to keep gambling to win back your losses, to either to break even or to fix things that are going wrong. And the chasing is something that really causes the brain to really have some irrational thinking, or disordered thinking, and people will chase, and all it does is make them further and further in debt as opposed to getting out of debt. And that's again where that financial devastation can occur, where you don't quite see the same thing with substance use addictions because the body eventually shuts down, passes out, something like that. There's a stop to it. So the money is the thing that will stop for people with gambling. But quite a few addictive disorders do share a lot of the same features and traits, right? It's just what makes each one of them a little unique, which is why they have their own name.
Yeah, yeah. So as I was preparing for this episode to talk with you, I mentioned the fact, oh, I'm going to talk with Jody about gambling. And I mentioned this to some friends. And one of their first thoughts was like, oh, I could never be a gambler because I'm so averse to risk. Um, can you talk about the idea of risk and how that plays into it from like a personality standpoint? If risk takers are more likely to gamble or not, or yeah, anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good distinction. Risk taking to me is also more impulsive. Right? And you'll see that even with individuals with substance use disorders or addictive behaviors, because even in recovery, they still like to take risks. They like to jump out of airplanes. They like to get really fancy tattoos in certain parts of their bodies, right? You can see this kind of extremism in a way in a risk taking. But what's also interesting is people might think that I'm too risk adverse. This could never happen to me, and I've seen people that were very risk adverse actually go, how did I fall prey to this? How did this happen to me? I've seen people that said, I have always been super, super tight with my money. And then gambling came along and I wasn't tight with it at all, right? And so that you've got impulsivity that could play into it. You could have a poor relationship with money that can play into it. Being too tight with your money isn't healthy. Being too loose with your money isn't healthy. You've got to find that sweet spot, and so that could cause it. But one thing with gambling, there's real money and there's gambling money, and there's two separate things inside the gambler's mind. And we all might think we have money, but if you have real money and you have gambling money, well, then gambling money is meant to gamble with. Real money is used to pay your mortgage or rent or car, food, all that kind of stuff. So when you run out of gambling money, what do? Well, you take from real money, right? But if you've won big at gambling, do you pay your car off? No, that's gambling money. That's meant to keep gambling with. And so to me, it's fascinating that there's these two views of money with people that gamble. And anybody, when they're actively gambling, thinks kind of crooked, right? I could sit behind you while you are in front of a slot machine and you'll be like, oh my gosh, I'm so close. And I'll be like, you lost, right? And so this concept of a near win is also what might make risk takers gamble more because they're storing a near win almost as if it was a win. They're storing that near miss as if it was almost a win, right? And so they're collecting data incorrectly, which is then feeding into do it one more time, try again. Right? So risk taking in and of itself is not just the only thing we would look at, but risk takers tend to fall in the category of being willing to be more impulsive as well and do things to really seek intense sensation. So placing a bet can be very intense.
Interesting. So, yeah, like sounded like you mentioned this misperception of like success versus failure, or um, you said collecting data, and if you're so close, then like that's almost a success, but really it's just a failure.
Totally.
Um, Another thing you mentioned made me think of this idea that, which I've heard several times, which is like when I go to gamble, I do it with friends. And, you know, if I lose, it's just like that's almost like the membership fee. Um, is that like an okay idea to have, or is that harmful, or what do you think?
Well, I mean, you have to look at gambling as the cost of your entertainment, right? You have to view gambling as entertainment. So people will spend a lot of money on a concert ticket. That's the cost of their entertainment, right? So if you gamble and you're like, yeah, I lost it. Well, that's because that was the cost of my entertainment. What gets people in trouble is when they think that gambling is a way of making money, right? Because then they're always expecting to have more than what they started with. which then gets into I'll place another bet so that I have a chance of doubling my money, something like that. Um, and I'll go back to the risk taking a little bit with that. When you look at the book, The Anxious Generation, they talk about a generation that never had to negotiate risk. They talk about when they were on the playground, there were so many safety things that you never had to be careful swinging on the bars that if you dropped, you might break your arm. And so we have a generation over and over again that was denied opportunities to negotiate risk. So then as they move into young adulthood and then, are able to gamble, they don't have the negotiating risk skills, and they're playing, and participating in something that has a lot more risk. So they're even more vulnerable at that point, right? So you have this deficit going into it, and then the games are even that much more psychologically designed.
Interesting. So basically, like coming to for lack of a better word, coming to the table with a lack of skills that you would need in order to kind of deal with um, this game that's meant to get you, and you don't have skills, and so then it gets you even worse.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Um, so one other thought I wanted to consider is just this idea of morality and gambling, and a lot of times I'll hear stories about. Um, Well, you even touched on like gambling away your car payment or stuff like that. And sometimes I just inherently think when I hear those, like, what is wrong with that? Like, that's my first thought. I know that's not a very kind way to think, but it's like, what's wrong with that person? And
It's the way a lot of people in the country think, right?
yeah. And so how do you like confront this idea of morality with gambling? Is there like a certain point where it's completely separated, or yeah, anything
Yeah.
you can touch on there?
Yeah, what we've seen over the years is we've become much more understanding when someone has a mental health disorder or when someone has a substance use disorder. We're not looking at them so strongly saying, "How could you do this?" Right? There was some research out of by a researcher out of Canada a couple years ago, and she was presenting at a conference, and some of the key takeaways from her research was that they were asking people if they felt that someone with an alcohol problem, if it was their fault, and a lot overwhelmingly said no. Is it someone's problem if they have obsessive compulsive disorder? No. Is it their fault if they have schizophrenia? No. Is it their fault if they have a gambling disorder? Yes. Right. So we're dealing with this, we're behind in our view of gambling as a potential disorder that some people are much more vulnerable to developing a gambling problem. And we're looking at it as something that they chose to do. Right. And it's a tricky line because people will say, well, yeah, I chose to gamble. And I'm like, but you didn't choose to get into so much trouble. It was like your brain was hijacked at that point. You weren't making rational decisions. Trying to prove to people that it is a diagnosable disorder, it's a treatable disorder, and that people do sometimes cross the line, just like people do with alcohol. People get DUIs and yet they're still behind the wheel, and then they, have another car accident and maybe kill somebody in the other car, right? All of that becomes this morality thing of how could you, how could you? But we are really far behind when we look at gambling disorders. Partially because we're showing gambling is everywhere and we're treating it as if it's so socially acceptable. Everyone's doing it. So if you get into trouble, there must be something really wrong with you. So lots of stigma still, even when you make a comment that's where your brain first goes. A lot of people, that's where their brain first goes, but then they stay there instead of saying, wait, it's a diagnosable disorder, but it's also treatable. So we have the stigma out there. We have a lot of um, the morality, the stigma, and then people who develop a gambling problem then do self stigma. How could I have done this? What is wrong with me? Instead of I have a disorder that a lot of people in this country also have.
Yeah. And I would imagine that's pretty hard probably for you as a clinician, but and also for them as a client, patient, whatever, to overcome that self stigma that's probably just like so deeply ingrained after years and years of conditioning.
Yeah, and it might not even be years and years depending on how quickly, gambling grabs them or how much financial, devastation they get into in a short amount of time. I see definitely the shame and the guilt. I see the self-stigma, because it looks like, "How could I have done this? Why didn't I stop?" Right? They're falling for, believing all the same things, that society is saying, "Why didn't you just stop?" Um, and they're saying when they look at the financial devastation, which is usually, again, the main thing that will get people to say, "Oh my gosh, I need help. Look what I've done." Then they're looking at this financial devastation and they're saying, "How am I ever gonna fix this? How am I ever gonna get out of this? What is my life gonna look like?" More shame, more self-stigma, right? Just piles on when they actually look at the financial consequences of what this disorder can do.
How can parents prevent their children from getting into problematic gambling or challenging gambling situations?
Yeah. Wow, that's a great question, and I think parents have to do a lot of different things, right? So if we could compare it to alcohol, what did we do? We did it pretty well, in the last generation or 2 about, don't drink and drive, be very careful if you are drinking. We've taught people, 1 drink an hour, but we never have those kind of conversations about gambling. Like, "Hey, I know this looks fun. I know the announcers on TV are talking about it. I know it's happening on a commercial. I know there's tons of apps. Let's talk about what responsible gambling looks like when you are of age to gamble." And in our state, it's 21 or what have you, right? And treat it the same as like this is illegal until you are of a certain age. But when you choose to gamble, it's because you have paid all your bills. This is a form of entertainment. You stick to your budget, you stick to your limit. You respect it as money, not gambling money, right? So there's several conversations repeatedly that parents can have in our actively gambling society. And just talking about gambling is not going to make somebody gamble, but it's going to get them curious about what is harmful, what is safe, what is responsible, what is irresponsible. And so just endorsing gambling, like, "What's the spread on the game on Sunday? Should we place a bet?" Well, no, you have to then continue the conversation and say, "But we only bet on 1 team because we're fans of that team. We don't bet on 16 teams." Right? And so you continue the conversation in a way that says, "This is how you keep a leash on it. This is how you treat it as a form of entertainment, and you don't take risks with it."
Great. So continuing down that road, um, can you talk about your thoughts on like complete abstinence versus moderation or harm reduction?
Yeah. It could be quite controversial for people if they're not familiar, but harm reduction is a fantastic model because harm reduction's ultimate goal is abstinence, just not right away.
Hmm.
And for many people, that can keep them engaged in therapy because you're not having this power control dynamic going on. You're saying, okay, if you want to continue to gamble, let's make sure you can afford to continue to gamble. Let's make sure we've done our budget, make sure we've paid all of our other bills, we've met all of our obligations, and then we know what's left over to gamble with, right? As opposed to, I want to gamble with $500. Well, can you afford $500 is the first question. Let's look at your finances. Many people will do well with harm reduction. You have to do a whole plan. You can't just try one thing and say, well, just stick to $100 a week. No, it's got to be if you're sports betting, which app are you using? Which team are you gambling with? Not all 16 teams in the football season. It's $100, but is it 1 day or are you gambling 2 days? Well, then that's $50 each day. What else are you doing that's not gambling related? What else are you doing that's socially related, that's good, right? It's gotta be all these things to create a harm reduction plan. not just a harm reduction action, like one thing to do.
Yeah.
Some people will come in and they're like, I just don't know if I'm ready to give up gambling. Okay, so let's talk about what responsible gambling would look like and let's see how it works for you. So as a therapist, we just keep revisiting how is it going, what is working, what isn't working. When you do that, clients eventually will succeed at harm reduction because they'll do other things in their life because you have to do more than just gamble, or they'll say, "What, I can't stick to this. We have to switch to abstinence. I've got to stop completely." And it's an internal shift, which means they're very motivated to keep figuring things out and to keep trying things and keep doing things. When people come in and we wag our finger and say, you need to stop, they're going to drop out of care. Right. So we really have to meet people where they're at. And harm reduction is extremely effective in working with this disorder. So that's one of the myths that people might not understand.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think um like this traditional and classic mindset of like sobriety counting and counting days um just doesn't really capture that idea, and so it's so easy to not even consider that. um and I would imagine you probably get some pushback from clients of like, I don't want to gamble at all, I want to be abstinent. Is that something that you have to overcome at all?
Yeah, some people really do want abstinence because they say, I've tried and I've tried, or my consequences are so severe. My family is so upset. I might lose my relationship if I don't stop. So, for those reasons, I want abstinence. So, we have lots of resources and lots of strategies to help people who want abstinence. When people still aren't sure if they want to stop gambling, we can talk about different forms of gambling that aren't so progressive. Believe it or not, the lottery is actually still really slow. It's like twice a day. You kinda place your number and then you wait, right? So you're not taking away gambling, but you're taking away the progression, and the ability to get into a lot of trouble in a very short amount of time. That might be just enough for somebody who says, "I'm not willing to quit yet," and you say, "Let's try something that's not as, progressive and harmful."
Yeah. Great. um you mentioned a variety of resources. What are some resources available for people?
Oh, there's so many more now, it's exciting. There's quite a few podcasts, right, just like yours, that really focus on, gambling and stopping gambling, the recovery side of it, the joys of the recovery side of it, what's life really like after gambling, right? So there's, topics for women only, for veterans, for the loved one. Right, so there's so many more resources, and I like the podcast format because it really is an instant on demand, and people can just quickly jump on a podcast, take in an episode, and I always say, feed your mind to feed your soul. There's, an app several apps are starting to hit the market, probably the one that's most well known is eVive, and that is for people who truly want to either do harm reduction or abstinence. And I say, so many people are using technology to get into trouble. Let's use technology to get out of trouble, right? They're still going to be on their phones. Give them a place to go. Give them this app. Some people really need guardrails on their money, on their finances. There's the TrueLink financial card that actually you can block gambling transactions. So people will carry that card in their wallet, has their name on it, has a Visa logo on it, doesn't work for gambling. People love that. Um, right, there's self-exclusion, which is a pretty big step, depending on the state you're in, where you literally tell legalized gambling operators, "Don't let me in." Whether it's brick and mortar, whether it's online, just don't let me in, close my account, don't market to me, don't send me emails, right? Nothing. So self-exclusion can be helpful. Blocking software can be really helpful because even though you can self-exclude from the legal sites, that doesn't mean you can't get to the illegal sites. So GamBan and Bet Blocker are two of the big ones that are an additional layer of protection. None of these are silver bullets. There is no silver bullet. It's do a lot of different things in concert together so that when you have the impulsive thought, there's a big distance or a big wall to climb over before you could actually do anything. And that usually really slows down that impulsivity so that you can make a better choice. And so those are just a couple of the resources. I love this industry is getting more and more resources than we've ever had before because we have more and more legalized gambling as well.
We touched on probably several myths, um, but what are maybe some of the bigger myths that you find to be damaging about gambling?
I mean, I think the biggest one is why can't you stop? When you really don't understand, this is hitting the dopaminergic system of the brain. It is creating a habit. And when you have a habit, it moves to another part of the brain. So it's not as front and center as making a conscious decision. I think another one is that if you have a lot of money, you can't develop a gambling problem. It just takes a little longer to develop a gambling problem, right? The more disposable income you have, the longer it will take before you have those financial consequences. But I have worked with many people who have lost millions of dollars, and I have worked with people who it was absolutely devastating to lose $20,000, right? And so the myth is that we measure money as if that says how severe somebody's gambling problem is or whether or not they could even develop a problem. There's no way he could develop a problem. He's a millionaire. Yep, there is, right? So just the public perception of it, and that people, "Oh, you can't get addicted, to, scratch offs." Yes, you can. You see people stand outside convenience stores, scratch them off, and go right back inside and buy more, and spend hundreds of dollars a day doing that. So, unfortunately, there are quite a few myths, and they're usually around, being able to control yourself and kind of the morality of it.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think a lot of this has been very insightful for me and eye opening, and I think I just really appreciate the work that you're doing. Again, we'll include a note to Better Institute in the show notes. And thanks so much for the conversation, Jody.
Thank you so much for having me. I think the biggest takeaway for everyone is there's help out there and that, we really want to make sure people get help and we have the conversation because for so many, they feel like there is no way out and they might even consider suicide. And so we're really here to try and save one life at a time.
Thank you so much. Thanks for joining us on this episode of The Adaptive Mind, brought to you by Nurture, the research-based app for overcoming unwanted or addictive behaviors. I hope you found our conversation insightful and inspiring. If you did, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback helps us reach more listeners and continue bringing these learnings to people that need them. Remember that you have an adaptive mind that does incredible things every day, and it's capable of even more. We'll see you in the next episode.